There is a theory about Neanderthals that I need you to hear before we discuss why it is wrong. Because it is compelling. It is the kind of story that feels like it should be true, the kind that lands in your gut before your brain has time to evaluate it. The theory was developed by Danny Vendramini, an independent researcher and theater director, and it proposes that Neanderthals were not our distant cousins or our occasional mating partners. They were our predators. Active, organized, nocturnal hunters who stalked early Homo sapiens across Ice Age Europe and the Levant, abducting females, killing males, and reducing the global human population to as few as 50 individuals before the survivors finally fought back and drove them to extinction. The visual that accompanies this theory is striking. Not the broadly human Neanderthal that decades of careful paleoanthropology has reconstructed, the stocky, upright, fire-using, hide-processing, ochre-applying, grief-practicing near-human that the fossil record actually shows us. Vendramini's Neanderthal is something else, fur-covered, hunched, ape-like, with enormous eyes adapted for nocturnal hunting and a posture modeled on chimpanzees. A monster from the dark. An apex predator of the night. The original nightmare that shaped everything we became. It is an extraordinary story. And the extraordinary story is wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not partially accurate with some good points mixed in. Wrong at the level of basic anatomy, wrong at the level of fundamental genetics, wrong at the level of what the fossil record actually contains, and wrong at the level of what the word human means in evolutionary biology. Let us start with the body. Because the single most important piece of anatomy in this entire debate is something most people have never heard of, the foramen magnum. The foramen magnum is the hole in the base of the skull through which the spinal cord passes. In quadrupeds, animals that walk on four legs, the foramen magnum is located toward the back of the skull, because the spine enters the skull from behind. In bipeds, animals that walk fully upright on two legs, the foramen magnum is located at the base of the skull, roughly in the center, because the spine rises vertically beneath the skull rather than entering from the rear. In Neanderthal skulls, the foramen magnum is in exactly the same anterior position as in modern human skulls. This is not ambiguous. This is not a matter of interpretation. This is measured anatomy, replicated across every Neanderthal skull we have ever recovered. Neanderthals walked fully upright. Their posture was essentially identical to ours in its fundamental geometry. Placing a Neanderthal skull on a chimpanzee-postured body, which is what the Vendramini reconstruction requires, would force the neck to bend at an angle that no Neanderthal neck vertebra supports. We have Neanderthal neck vertebrae. We have checked. The posture Vendramini describes is anatomically impossible for a species with Neanderthal skull architecture. The fur is equally simple to address. We know Neanderthals lost their ancestral primate fur approximately 2 million years ago, in the same evolutionary transition that affected all subsequent hominins including ourselves. We know this because Neanderthal stone tool assemblages are filled with hide scrapers, tools used to process animal hides for clothing, and because we have bone awls from Neanderthal sites, tools used to pierce hide for sewing. You do not spend hundreds of hours processing and sewing animal hides if you already have a coat of fur. The clothing was the fur replacement. The technology was the biological adaptation. This is what makes us the kind of animal we are. We replace biological solutions with cultural ones. Neanderthals have been doing exactly this for 300,000 years before any Homo sapiens arrived in Europe. The Neanderthal hunting record is one of the most thoroughly documented aspects of their existence. And what it documents is not a creature limited to a handful of prey species by a restricted diet. The theory claims Ice Age Europe had only 5 or 6 edible plants worth harvesting, which is demonstrably incorrect. It documents an apex predator of extraordinary range and adaptability. Horses and deer were primary prey across most of Europe. Bison, woolly rhinos, and woolly mammoths appear in the faunal record at multiple sites, with evidence suggesting that young mammoths were regularly hunted and adult proboscideans were not beyond their capability. Ibex, animals that retreat into near-vertical cliff terrain that gives them a massive defensive advantage, appear repeatedly in Neanderthal sites in Mediterranean and mountainous regions. They were hunting prey that could escape onto terrain that punished the hunters for pursuing it, and they were doing it successfully. The Mediterranean Neanderthals extended this dietary range further still. Coastal sites show the remains of fish, mussels, crabs, seals, dolphins, and seabirds. Inland sites contain fish from rivers and streams, and turtles. Dental microwear analysis, the microscopic examination of the surface texture of fossil teeth, shows the mixed wear pattern of a species consuming both hard plant material, nuts, seeds, and animal protein, not the single texture wear of a committed carnivore. Charred nuts have been recovered from Middle Eastern Neanderthal sites, acorns, walnuts, pistachios, hazelnuts, pine nuts. The claim that Ice Age Europe offered no meaningful plant foods that Neanderthals would bother with is not a reading of the evidence. It is a projection of the theory onto a diet record that contradicts it at every site. The injuries in Neanderthal remains tell us something important about the hunting style. Between 79 and 94% of Neanderthal skeletal remains show evidence of healed major traumatic injuries. Up to 50% of known Neanderthal individuals were severely injured at some point during their lifetimes. The distribution of those injuries, concentrated in the upper body, head, and neck, has been compared by researchers to the injury profile of modern rodeo riders, people whose injuries come from repeated close-range contact with large, forceful, unpredictable animals. This is the signature of close-range weapon hunting. Not the signature of an ambush predator of slow-moving bipeds. They were getting hurt hunting large dangerous animals at close range. The animals were fighting back. This is exactly what you would expect from a species using thrusting spears rather than projectile weapons, a style of hunting that requires getting close enough to be within the prey animal's defensive range. The cannibalism in the record is real and should not be minimized. Of approximately 300 Neanderthal individuals recovered, around 15 show evidence of cannibalism, butchery marks on human bones consistent with defleshing and marrow extraction. This is approximately 5% of the sample. It is a documented Neanderthal behavior. But it is also a documented Homo sapiens behavior, with more examples of cannibalism recorded in the Homo sapiens archaeological record than in the Neanderthal record. And it tells us nothing about interspecies predation. Intraspecies cannibalism, practiced occasionally under specific circumstances by a species that also buried its dead, cared for its injured, and processed hides for clothing, is not evidence that the same species was conducting organized cross-species hunting raids on modern humans. That inferential leap requires evidence. The evidence does not exist. The genetic evidence is where the Neanderthal predation theory meets its most decisive refutation. Not because the genetics are simple, they are not. But because what the genetics show is so directly, specifically incompatible with the theory's core claim that no amount of reframing can accommodate both. Every person alive today with ancestry outside sub-Saharan Africa carries between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. This is not a statistical artifact. It is not contamination. It is a real, reproducible, independently verified signal of gene flow between the two species, of actual interbreeding that produced offspring who survived, reproduced, and whose descendants are walking around today. The Neanderthal sequences in modern human genomes are not randomly distributed. Some regions of the genome show higher Neanderthal ancestry than others. And critically, some of the retained Neanderthal variants have been linked to functional effects, immune system variants that may have helped Homo sapiens manage the pathogen environments of Eurasia that the Neanderthals had adapted to over 300,000 years, skin and pigmentation variants consistent with adaptation to higher latitudes and lower UV environments, metabolic variants possibly related to cold climate energy management. These are not neutral passengers. They were retained by natural selection because they were useful. The Neanderthal genes that persisted in Homo sapiens are, in meaningful part, the genes that helped Homo sapiens survive in the environments Neanderthals had spent 300,000 years mastering. Now consider what the theory requires. For Vendramini's hypothesis to be true, the genetic admixture between the two species would have to result primarily from non-consensual contact, abduction, the theory specifically proposes. This is a claim about social and behavioral complexity that requires specific evidence. What we actually know about the conditions under which genetic admixture between closely related species occurs suggests that sustained interbreeding is far more common in contexts of regular social contact than in contexts of predator-prey relationships. A species that is actively hunting another for food does not typically produce viable offspring with that prey species over multiple generations across a wide geographic range. The 1 to 4% Neanderthal signal in modern human genomes is not the genetic record of predation. It is the genetic record of contact. Of two species who recognized each other as something between familiar and other, and on enough occasions, across enough generations, resolved that recognition in a specific way. The Levant is where this contact almost certainly began. Homo sapiens were present in the Levant from at least 100,000 years ago, possibly earlier. Neanderthals occupied the same region across a much longer span, including periods when Homo sapiens were not there and periods when both species were present. The sites show this in their stratigraphy: modern human layers above Neanderthal layers above modern human layers, at different time periods in the same caves. The temporal interleaving is not primarily synchronous occupation. They were often using the same locations at different times, pulled there by the same geographic logic of water and shelter and prey. But synchronous contact also occurred. We know this because the genetics say it did. Something happened in the Levant over tens of thousands of years that produced viable offspring carrying genes from both lineages. And whatever that something was, it was not predation. The ochre-stained shell placed on the ground between two figures at 5 meters distance is a fictional reconstruction. But the shells themselves are real, perforated marine shells with ochre pigment found at Spanish Neanderthal sites, dated to before Homo sapiens arrived in Europe. Personal adornment. Symbolic behavior. The species the theory calls a nocturnal predator was making jewelry. The Mysterian tool tradition, the tool-making technology associated with Neanderthals across 300,000 years of European and Asian occupation, requires a closer examination than it typically receives in popular presentations. Because the Vendramini hypothesis depends, implicitly, on Neanderthals being less cognitively sophisticated than the evidence actually supports. The idea of a predatory nocturnal creature hunting by instinct is incompatible with the behavioral record of the species it is attributed to. Producing birch bark tar, the adhesive used to haft flint points onto wooden spear shafts at Neanderthal sites, requires deliberately heating birch bark within a specific temperature range to produce the usable adhesive. Too cold and the tar does not flow. Too hot and it degrades. The process has been experimentally reproduced, and it requires practice, attention, and an understanding of cause and effect across a manufacturing sequence. This is not crude technology. This is chemistry, empirically derived, culturally transmitted, and representing a level of procedural knowledge that we associate with cognitive sophistication. The hafted spear itself is a composite tool: flint point, wooden shaft, birch tar adhesive, sinew binding. Multiple materials, multiple processing steps, a manufacturing sequence that must be executed in the correct order. The spear in our Neanderthal's hand is not a rough stick. It is an engineered object whose design is the product of accumulated knowledge transmitted across generations through demonstration and practice. The ochre application to the cave wall is a different category of evidence entirely. Mineral ochre, iron oxide pigment, has no survival function. It does not keep you warm. It does not process food. It is not a tool for any immediately practical purpose. Its application to a surface represents the desire to mark, to signal, to communicate through symbol. Whether this constitutes art in the full modern human sense is debated by researchers. What is not debated is that it is deliberate, purposeful, and non-survival directed behavior. A species in which individuals mark surfaces with mineral pigment is a species with cognitive architecture that can represent meaning through symbol. This is the species the theory calls a primitive ape-like predator. The burial evidence is the most emotionally significant. Neanderthals buried their dead. This is not universal in the record. Not every Neanderthal death resulted in a deliberate burial, and the practice may not have carried the full symbolic weight of later human mortuary behavior. But the deliberate positioning of bodies in grave cuts, the articulated skeletal arrangements that indicate burial shortly after death, the Shanidar individuals who survived severe disability because their group sustained them, these are not the behavioral record of a species that operated purely on predatory instinct. They are the behavioral record of a species with social bonds strong enough to motivate care for the dying, attention to the dead, and the maintenance of individuals who could not contribute to the group's immediate survival. The population scale is the final practical refutation of the predation hypothesis. There were never more than approximately 10,000 Neanderthals across all of Europe and Asia simultaneously. Each band consisted of roughly 20 individuals, half of whom were adults, many of whom were injured. The 79 to 94% healed trauma statistic means that at any given time, a significant proportion of a Neanderthal group's adults were recovering from or living with serious injuries. The available force for organized long-range cross-species raiding from any single band was not an army. It was a small group of heavily worked adults trying to survive the same winter that Homo sapiens groups across the valley were also trying to survive. The idea of a coordinated continental campaign of Neanderthal predation against Homo sapiens does not survive contact with the actual population numbers. Here is what the theory gets right, inadvertently. The encounter between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens was consequential. It shaped both species. It may have involved conflict. We have some evidence of conflict between Neanderthal groups, and it would be naive to assume that first contact between different hominin populations always resulted in peaceful exchange. The Levant, where the longest period of coexistence occurred, is a region rich in archaeological complexity that we are still in the early stages of understanding. The Neanderthal disappearance, concentrated between 40,000 and 45,000 years ago, is still not fully explained, and the arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe was certainly part of the pressure that contributed to it. But the mechanism the theory proposes, organized predation by Neanderthals on Homo sapiens as a primary driver of human cognitive and cultural evolution, is not what the evidence shows. The evidence shows two species that diverged from a common ancestor between 500,000 and 700,000 years ago, lived independently on different continents for most of that time, and then encountered each other again in the Levant and later in Europe. When they met, they interacted in ways complex enough to produce genetic mixing, cultural exchange, and possibly conflict, all at once, in different contexts, over tens of thousands of years. The outcome was asymmetric. Homo sapiens persisted, Neanderthals did not as an independent lineage. But the Neanderthal contribution to the modern human genome means that in the most literal biological sense, the species did not entirely end. Between 1 and 4% of everyone reading these words is Neanderthal. The theory persists not because of its evidence but because of its story. The idea that we were hunted, that our intelligence and language and culture were forged in the crucible of an existential threat from a stronger, more powerful species, that we are the hardened survivors of a prehistoric war we almost lost, this is a story that activates something deep in the specific kind of nervous system that spent hundreds of thousands of years being genuinely threatened by things that wanted to eat it. It plays in the same cognitive register as every monster story ever told. And there is nothing wrong with that register existing. Stories that activate ancient fears perform a real psychological function. The problem is when the story is presented as science. When a hypothesis built on selective reading of evidence, fundamental anatomical errors, and the projection of 21st century assumptions about Paleolithic behavior onto a population we know only from bones and tools is framed as a corrective to mainstream scientific consensus, when the implicit claim is that the experts are wrong and the independent researcher has the hidden truth, the story becomes actively harmful to understanding. Not because the mainstream is always right. It is not. But because the standard for overturning a century of paleoanthropological research is more evidence than a handful of misread anatomy and an unfalsified theory about nocturnal predation. The actual Neanderthal is more interesting than the theory's monster. The actual Neanderthal processed hides for clothing, made birch tar adhesive for hafted tools, applied ochre to cave walls, cared for injured group members for years, buried the dead, interbred with Homo sapiens, and left functional immune variants in our genomes that we are still using today. The actual Neanderthal survived 300,000 years of Ice Age Europe using intelligence, social cooperation, and transmitted cultural knowledge. The actual Neanderthal is our relative, the closest relative our species has ever had. We share a fire with them in the dark. We always have. The genes say so.